What is going on, guys? This is Skyhound, also known as Xavier Pierce, Geek Archivist. So it's 2025, and for most Ranger fans, you likely already know that the setting of SPD is set in this year. With that being said, considering that the show did air in February, I felt like going over my list of my favorite top 10 episodes. Now, I want to keep in mind that I will have to give also a quick shout out to Catherine Sutherland and Nakia, who host their own YouTube channel, Power Rangers Playback. Why am I bringing this up? Because one of the actors that I met was John Tui. For those of you guys who know which roles he played, if you're going to say Doggie Cruger as well as Solaris Knight, that's correct, but how many fans in the Ranger fandom know about the episode SWAT for SPD? Let me clarify this for you guys. Most people do not know this, and I am not lying here. He did 3 roles. Let me clarify this for you before I go into that list, just to give context. John Tui also voiced the character known as Srgt. Silverback. Yes, that orangutan, that SWAT instructor. You guys want proof? I will put in the link in the description down below regarding that interview. There is only one person, me, that brought this up. And when I brought it up, I still remember he was like, oh yeah, because he knows he did that one. And when I met the guy again in 2022 for the first time, his booth was right next to the actor that played Boom. Yeah, that guy. Now, for those of you guys who know the actor, he was also in a bunch of other roles. He was also in Mystic Force as a particular character. He was also a Ranger, or at least a character of his was a Ranger in Ninja Steel. FYI, I want to be clear. I did not watch the rest of it. I'm just clarifying here. But yeah, I met both of those guys. With that being said, and with a little bit of, what was going on in terms of who I met and all of that, let's get straight to the list, shall we? Okay, so before I go into the list, I want to be clear here. I know some episodes were two-parters. I've said this before when I was doing Lightspeed Rescue. I am treating this as one extremely lengthy episode. Because if we're going to be doing arcs, those require more than one chapter. So I can't actually put it into one full, episode, so to speak. With that being said, coming in at number 10, I have to go with the second, I believe second, yeah. It is the second Dino Thunder team up. I want to be clear. They did this twice. Twice! The first being episode 31, known as History. Wormhole is the second one. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, I'm not sure if it was mentioned, but Jeffrey Perazzo, if you look at the credits, this is the only time where Jason David Frank, may he rest in peace, he was not in this episode. So Jeffrey Perazzo in this case was actually doing double duty. And if you guys want context, I'm also roughly reading from the Wikipedia for Power Rangers SPD. It says that Jeffrey Perazzo voiced Dr. Tommy Oliver, the Black Dino Ranger. That is the only time where he did voice, a fellow Ranger, so to speak. Kelsey Henderson, who did Boom. I will get to him in a bit. But basically, with regards to the episode Wormhole, I remember this pretty damn well. Basically, Grum finds this wormhole and decides to try and go back to the past in order to try and, conquer the world. Basically, what he knows is that SPD did not exist in 2004. However, the B Squad, as well as Doggie Cruger, realize what Grum's trying to do, follows him into the wormhole, and so Grum then decides to try to team up with Zeltrax in order to try and, conquer the world, so to speak. However, when the SPD Rangers do team up with the Dino Thunder Rangers, sorry, I'm slipping a little. Eventually, there is a bit of conflict between, Zeltrax and, Dr. O. They do succeed in winning, but I will say that I like some of the writing in this episode to an extent. But there is one moment that some would say is a little, I guess you could say, a bit of a meme. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's the whole thing where Doggie Cruger goes, it's not about the size of the dog in the fight, it's about the size of the fight in the dog. And then most of them keep going, no one gets inside our circle. But I will say that, it looks one way, like you're trying to hold the line, but most fans would say somebody got inside as a jab, towards that. So most of it was pretty good in terms of the fight. I do like the team up. I will say though that the part that got me grinning is the fact that give me 1 second, I'm trying to remember characters here. Josephine Davison, who played Morgana, the grown-up Mora, if you will. She was in this episode, and she did point out towards the end of the team up that if you do not go back into that wormhole, you're going to have to do conquering all those worlds that you did all over again. And he's like, damn it, you're right. And he has to go back. And what I kind of find fun is that in terms of wiping the memories, they kind of go a little primitive on the whole, I guess you could say Men in Black type of thing. Instead of the neuralizer, they were using some sort of device that almost looks like a photo, the old-fashioned cameras back in the old days. And so, as they're going back, Jack is like, "Hey, Commander, you coming?" And he's like, "Yeah, one moment." And then he, does the wipe of memory on himself as well. Because they also have to do the same with the Rangers, with the Dino Thunder Rangers, to make sure they didn't know too much, so to speak. Overall, I will say that the writing was pretty decent in terms of, keeping it objective. So, from an objective standpoint, I would give this one at best an 8 out of 10. Subjectively, I'd bump that up 1 point. But that's just the rough summary of the two-parter, or at least I thought it was a two-parter. Sorry, I can't believe I said two-parter. Wormhole is actually one episode. Let me rephrase here. Sorry, guys. There's some episodes that have two and have to combine into one, but Wormhole is the second Dino Thunder episode. I want to be clear here. That's just roughly the summary from memory on my thoughts on Wormhole. This episode aired on February 2nd of 2006. Okay, coming in at number 9 is the two-part ending of SPD known as Endings. Now, before I go on any further, if you guys remember when I was doing my intro at the start, I mentioned about meeting at least 2 of the actors from SPD. That is John Tui as well as Mr. Henderson, who fans know in SPD did Boom, but Kelson Henderson has done numerous characters from the Power Rangers franchise. Most notably, when I was discussing about the franchise as a whole with Mr. Henderson, this was back in 2022. And what happened was I was waiting to talk with Mr. Tui, except someone else was already over at his booth, and their booth was right next to each other. And what I definitely recall when I was there was there was another booth right next to Mr. Henderson's, and that one had like a lot of the props, or at least some props from some of the seasons, even some from SPD. Unfortunately, when I was there, I knew I was going to be talking with some people, but I will say this, my documentation skills were not that well developed, I would say. I got some of it, but in terms of like, procedure, what else? Etiquette, things like that. This is something that I understood to a degree, but not entirely. Now, in 2022, that was actually my first and only time that I got the chance to go to Power Morphicon. It was actually on my birthday, which also happens to be the day that Power Rangers actually began. So being able to go there on my birthday for Power Morphicon, that was definitely a treat I am never going to forget. So as I was waiting to talk with Mr. Tui, I was discussing with Mr. Henderson a bit about, his thoughts on being on SPD a little bit. What was a little bit amusing is I was discussing about favorite moments, and oddly enough, I didn't realize that I actually answered the question. And it had to do with the episode endings, where it came to, Boom giving the speech to the cadets, despite Boom being a failed cadet himself. And obviously, it's when the cadets realize that, Broodwig has a bunch of, Trubian lackeys, robots, including Crybots, to try and infiltrate the SPD base. And they're not sure that they might actually get out of this alive. But Boom is trying to point out to the cadets, he, along with Omega Ranger and Cat, they're planning on staying because Boom knows that the Rangers would also be staying for him. Now, with that part being said, Mr. Henderson did mention to me that out of all the roles that he did, the one that he really enjoyed doing was the character Mechanic. And he was actually in Ninja Steel. But he does make appearances in the season that pretty much ended the Power Ranger franchise, Dino Fury, as well as the sequel after that. So, in summary, Boom may not have been a Ranger, but in hindsight, another character, even though they're both played by the same actor, does get to become a Ranger. That's roughly what I remember when we were discussing about it. Now, with that part out of the way, let's get into the two-parter finale. So some key points that happen here are as follows. The A Squad turns out to be alive. They do manage to capture Doggie Cruger, and then eventually they do face against the B Squad. But of course B Squad does get their butts handed to them and then get brought over into Grum's ship. In addition to that, they find out that there is something called Omni that is actually planning on trying to invade Earth, so to speak. And Grum, obviously, to an extent, answers to it. So, Broodwig does eventually break into SPD, takes control of the Delta Command Megazord. In addition, Piggy eventually does come to his senses and does help the Rangers get out. In addition, Doggie Cruger does realize that Jack, despite being a Red Ranger for a certain amount of time, realizes that his priorities lie elsewhere. So when Doggie does bring it up, Jack is like, why are we bringing this up now? Doesn't seem like we're about to get out of here anytime soon. And prior to saying that, of course, Jack tries to downplay the whole situation, telling Doggie, "You're wrong, sir. I love SPD." And Doggie does know that throughout his time as SPD, he has shown his dedication. But Doggie points out, but you and I know that your loyalties lie elsewhere. So, right when they're about to be supposedly executed, there's one crybot literally that supposedly malfunctions, and Bridge does bring that up. But then they find out that Piggy is actually in one of the get-ups of crybots. So just when the Rangers are about to stay and help Doggie, Doggie's pointing out, you guys need to get back to Earth and try to stop, Broodwing, which eventually they do. Now, this also points out where eventually, once the Rangers do stop Broodwing, they still have to deal with the traitorous A Squad. But there is something interesting about this two-parter, which does bring up a little bit of some issues with writing. There is one commenter who explains that despite A Squad being supposedly the best, they still supposedly have terrible tech, and B Squad has the SWAT gear. So, looking at it from an objective standpoint, definitely B Squad has something that A Squad does not, which is true. So after the Rangers do defeat Broodwing, they then have to face A Squad again. The difference, however, is that B Squad understands the quirks and quips of A Squad. And despite being taken down a little bit, their leader, who is actually a female, before I go on any further, some people always forget, and I'm not one that does forget, the whole thing with female characters and then the whole female Red Ranger thing, I'm gonna have to bash heads here. SPD started this. For those who complain, it started it. Not Samurai, SPD. So, A Squad is berating B Squad, and they kind of get a little bit in over their heads with their ego and everything else that because we're A Squad, we're the best, and B Squad is second rate and all that. However, once B Squad does equip themselves with the SWAT mode, that's where the tide changes. And of course, B Squad does use their judgment on, A Squad. They're guilty, and, the leader goes, you can't do this to us. We're the A Squad. And of course, it shows guilty on the badge, and then Jack is like, looks like you've been demoted. And obviously, they get put in containment cards. So, when things start to literally take a turn for the worst, this is roughly after, B Squad does use the SWAT Megazord and destroys the A Squad's Megazord. Eventually, Cruger does fight against Grum, but what doesn't seem to make a little bit of sense in terms of writing is the fact that Icinia is actually alive. They don't explain the details on that. In addition, the fight between Grum and Cruger, I will say kudos to the suit actors for this. They did a good job on it. What's interesting is the fact that Grum knows that Omni is close to being formed, and he kind of baits Doggie Cruger to an extent. Doggie does save his wife, but Grum points out to Cruger, oh Cruger, what to do? You couldn't save your own people back on Sirius, and you will, not be bringing me in. I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. He lets go after he's holding on to Cruger for a bit, and he obviously gets saved by his wife. And as he's trying to find the controls to try and stop Omni from being formed, he then has a final talk, supposedly with Cat and the others. So once Doggie lays out the plan, Cat is a bit upset and she's like, you know, you might not be able to. And Doggie knows what she's about to say because she cares for him not as a superior but also as a friend. And he's like, I know, Cat. So eventually Doggie does find the controls, and it has to be done manually, unfortunately. And the Rangers do take their shot with the Megazord. And this is after Omni does get formed. In addition to that, the rest of the cadets, as well as Boom and Cat and Omega Ranger, they're faced with literal insurmountable odds by so many Crybots and other Trubian army troops. Eventually, SPD headquarters do send help. And one of them happens to be Srgt. Silverback, which I will get to in a little bit in one of the episodes. But eventually, Omni does get destroyed. And they think that Doggie Cruger's dead, but they find out that he actually survives and is walking along with his wife. And eventually, the final fight between Doggie and Grum does occur. Jack was offering to help out, but Doggie flatly points out, no, this fight is mine. And Doggie does prove it. And the thing was is that Grum's like, show no mercy, Doggie Cruger, but Doggie does. And he cuts off the other part of the horn of Grum before putting him in a containment card. Afterwards, they do a sort of a repeat of the test of character, you could say, that Doggie Cruger does for those who he thinks would be worthy of being the Red Ranger. This happens right after he tells the other Rangers that Jack decides to leave SPD. Z, of course, is not surprised by the news. And then he calls forth Srgt, gives him the exact same question that he did at the first episode, which is beginnings. If I was to appoint Sid as Red Ranger, would you be willing to follow her into battle? And Srgt this time points out, answers differently and says, Sir, I would follow anybody who you deem worthy to wear the color red. This, of course, enables Sky to pass the test, and he is now the new Red Ranger. At this point, Bridge then becomes the Blue Ranger. Z and Sid retain their colors, and there is no more green. There is something interesting that does get brought up in Operation Overdrive with Once a Ranger. Bridge sort of explains this. So you could say that time-wise, Bridge does explain what will happen to him, but he kind of does it in a messy way. So they stop by where Jack is with his girlfriend, and they give him some donation for clothes and the like. When Sky gets a call, he looks at Jack briefly and he's like, go for it, letting him know that the torch has already been passed and I've already had my time. Objectively, I will say that this one has issues. So if I were to really rate this one, I'd give this one a 7 out of 10. Subjectively, however, I'd bump it up maybe at best to a 9. At best. But that's just the rough summary of the two-parter of endings, as well as me giving my general convention story meeting with some of the actors. Coming in at number 8 is the Dr. Cat Manx centric episode Catastrophe. While this episode was actually brief, you could say, and also introduced a new character briefly, I'll give the summary as best as I can. Supreme Commander Fowler Birdie did offer Cat a chance to work at SPD Galaxy Command, but the Rangers and Boom know how useful and helpful she is to them, not just in, the Zords and tech and all of that. Yeah, she's really smart, but also she has to deal eventually with an old schoolmate by the name of Mooney. The difference being is that Kat and her mentality, the way how she did things, is different from her colleague. And then they later find out that Mooney is trying to create a weapon known as a Helios generator. When Birdie learns about this, he then gives Kat permission to return to Earth and gives her a particular morpher, but it only lasts for 1 hour. She does use it and eventually brings Mooney to justice, but she was able to do what she needed to do. So while I was giving a rough summary of the episode Catastrophe, I will say that objectively, this was probably one where I think it gave enough information about characters, but sometimes when it comes to character-centric stories, I think they did some better than others. Even though the morpher only lasted for an hour, at least it allowed Kat to do what she needed to do. So if I had to give a rating on this one objectively, I'd give this at best an 8. Subjectively, I'd likely give it the same rating, but overall that's the rough summary as well as my general thoughts on Catastrophe. This episode aired on September 26, 2005. Okay guys, so before I actually do get started for going over my picks for number 7 as well as 6, both of these are related to the actor John Tui, which I mentioned at this intro before this recording actually started. Now, for those of you guys who have been to Power Morphicon, you likely know that this is a convention for Power Rangers. So with that part being said, I actually pointed out on a post I did for a community, and this was to quiz some people with regards to the number of roles that John Tui did. Most, however, unfortunately, I have to stress this out. I'm not being rude, but you guys do need to do a little bit more research. I'm sorry if I'm stumbling a little bit or if I'm going too fast. The point is, I put this out some days ago, and it was very simple. The question on this was, how many roles did Mr. Tui actually have in Power Rangers? So, unfortunately, it was split down the middle. And the choices were 1, 3, or 2. Well, the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, he actually had 3 roles. Now notice, when I started doing the intro, I mentioned about the interview that Catherine Sutherland and Nakia, shout out to those ladies, who do Power Rangers Playback. And they actually interviewed John Tui about this. So, if you guys notice, I likely put in the screenshot for when I asked my question. Obviously, I let my real self be known to those 3. And for a time, I was a member of Power Rangers Playback. So I do ask the question to John Tui, and I will be putting this clip right before I get started on my pick for number 6. Okay, now that you guys have the general idea in terms of, me meeting John Tui and all that, I will go a little bit further on this one with the 2-parter Shadow. For those of you guys who know this one, this is where Doggie Cruger does kind of explain to the Rangers a bit about himself. But the way how it starts out is that Doggie is plagued by the events of what happened on Sirius when there is a particular general that gets busted out of prison. And he kind of and Cruger does get a little bit, how would I put this? He gets a little bit annoyed at the Rangers to an extent. And he does kind of like explain his story to the Rangers about what happened. But he leaves a particular key point out. And the fact that he is plagued by, what happened back then, he's like, what do you, why are you guys acting like this? Do you think this is some kind of a playground? I'm kind of like paraphrasing here, but he's just like annoyed so much that Jack has to step in. He's like, hey, I don't care that you are our commander. You're not allowed to talk to us like that. And, Doggie's like, standing up for your team, Jack? And he's like, yeah, I am. It's about time you start taking your leadership responsibilities more seriously. And he eventually kind of dismisses them out, much to Kat's dismay. And just as she's about to open her mouth, he whips his head towards her. And he's like, not a word out of you either. And her expression, she's like really annoyed as well. And the Rangers are like confused. It's like, I don't get like what's got him so riled up. And then when Kat comes in, she's like, I apologize for the way the commander's been acting, but there is something that he left out in his story. And eventually there is a point where Kat does give something to Doggie. And one of the things that is a hint in terms of, Doggie being haunted by his past is that we learn that the general, whose name is Banog, is the one who actually caused a bit of grief to Doggie Cruger, supposedly. But we see the camera point out that the sword that he has, it's actually like right next to his station. And unfortunately, when Doggie Cruger learns that Banog is out of prison, that's when obviously, he kind of discloses the whole story. I know I'm kind of like bouncing around a bit, but eventually Cat does go missing, and eventually when the Rangers eventually confront Doggie for his attitude towards them, Cat does explain to Doggie that I'm kind like I said, I'm bouncing around on this. There is a point where Cat does tell Doggie that you shouldn't be keeping secrets from the Rangers, and that if they are to be open with you about what's going on with them, you should be doing the same in terms of setting an example. And Doggie's like really annoyed, and Cat just kind of stands her ground, and she's like, growl at me all you want, it's the truth. And this does eventually have to force Doggie to take a different viewpoint and realize that he's not always right despite being ranked higher, so to speak. So when Cat does eventually get captured by Banog, Cruger does eventually tell the Rangers a key point that he left out in his story about what happened on Sirius, his home planet. And that Banog had snuck in and somehow captured his wife Icenia. And the Rangers eventually do sympathize with Cruger that he lost his home planet, he lost his squad, and he also lost his wife. But Doggie simply just points out, knowing all of that doesn't make it any better for me. But eventually, Banog does kind of like issue Doggie Cruger a challenge when Rick comes back and he's damaged pretty badly. And that's where the recording comes in from Banog. Doggie does show up and eventually does face not just Banog, but he eventually also gets the little gift that Cat gives him, which is a morpher. And he eventually morphs and becomes the Shadow Ranger and takes out 100 of the Crybots that Banog sends out to him. The funny thing is that it shows the exact number on the chest plate, 100. So the fact that he goes against 100 Crybots, eventually, Cruger does face Banog. But the interesting thing is that when it comes to judging Banog and all of that, Doggie gets one detail right, but he gets the other detail wrong when he mentions about his wife Icenia. So when the morpher shows that that Banog is innocent on that part, Banog roughly points out, I'm just paraphrasing here from memory, Banog is telling him that there are certain things that he does not know, and that, he likely will not find out. But Doggie counters and states, that may be true, but I do know where you're heading, before he uses his finisher with his sword to put Banog in a containment car. And obviously he eventually manages to save Cat on top of that. But the one thing that I will admit that's kind of like obvious is that they do take bits from the Sentai version. They just change a few superficial details, so to speak. Because in the Sentai version, Miss Swan actually does care about, you know, the boss, so to speak. But in this one, they kind of like I said, they changed up a few things superficially. The truck is almost the same in terms of the footage. The way how they did the inside, however, is different. I'm just saying. Now, with those details out of the way, if I had to give this a rating, I'm giving this objectively, at best, somewhere between a 7 and an 8. Subjectively, I'd bump it up to at least maybe a 9. That's just the rough summary that I'm giving, as well as my general thoughts on the episode Shadow, or episodes. Sorry, I don't know why I said episode, but this is a two-parter, which I'm sort of trying to treat as one entire episode because it kind of is. The first half of it aired on April 16 of 2005. The second half was 7 days later. Okay, guys, so before I get started on the rough summary that I'm giving on the episode Abandoned, which is after the two-parter of Shadow, when I met John Tui in 2022, we did discuss a little bit about my question from Power Rangers Playback, and I did recall discussing with him about favorite quotes and all of that. I roughly remember asking him, "Do you have any favorite quotes from the show when you were on there?" And he told me, I don't quite remember it that well, so I do kind of give a rough summary of what happened with Abandoned, and I quote it with particularly the ending part. I'm going to go line by line here. Right after Jack and the others realized they kind of took, the commander for granted. And Jack tells him at the end, "You're right. I guess we sort of did take you for granted. It won't happen again, sir." Good. Because I can't stand watching you getting your morphers kicked all over the city. And I recall Mr. Tui had like a slight grin on his face as I was, reciting those parts line by line. And I remember him telling me when we were discussing a little bit that since he himself is also a father, he knows that Commander Cruger is kind of like a father figure to the Rangers. Besides being their commander and a mentor, he treats them almost like, his own in terms of family. So he's pointing out that, yes, he was trying to teach them a lesson as a mentor, but also the fact that he does care for them. And to point out, Cruger does point out that no one ranger is more important than another, that they all have to work together. That's roughly what he was telling me, as I recall, when we were discussing a little bit about it. With that little tidbit out of the way, that's just one part that we were discussing about, by the way. With that out of the way, let's get straight into the episode Abandoned. So what roughly happens is that B Squad, despite them getting, the commander, and him being a ranger and all that, they unfortunately take things for granted when a stone that enhances the power of darkness does get stolen from a librarian who was guarding it. And when Grum gets his hands on it, and Cruger does realize that what it does, B Squad does try to confront the monster that has it. And just because Kruger was there, they thought that, they think that because Shadow Ranger's around, they can take it easy. What they don't realize, however, is that Doggie has really, really good hearing for his species, so to speak. And he does overhear what the Rangers are saying in the break room. So when Doggie does show up on the scene, they thought that, oh, okay, Shadow's going to be helping us out, that, the enemy's in trouble and all that. However, he just stands there and doesn't do anything. So eventually, the Rangers do have to handle it on their own, and they do succeed. So when they were asking about, why didn't Shadow Ranger show up, and what was he doing? That's when the commander, straight out berates them and calls them out on their hypocrisy. Which of course leads to that iconic bit at the end, which I really enjoy, because despite the fact that the commander, is, higher than them in terms of rank, he still also has a bit of, a softer side. When, of course, he said, because I can't stand watching you guys getting your morphers kicked all over the city. I mean, it is a bit toned down in terms of him not literally cursing, but to me, I would say from an objective standpoint, that's very appropriate because it is a bit of a kid's show. And he is pointing out that, he couldn't stand watching them, embarrass themselves like that, because knowing others, had they seen how B Squad was acting and them getting their butts handed to them, you could say that they would be laughing as well. It's like, the B Squad, that's a bit embarrassing, but you get the idea. And of course, the Rangers kind of like, oh, so he can talk smack. And, the commander's laughing at, his own joke there. So they realized that, they were wrong. They admitted that they made a mistake, and all's well. So objectively, I'd give this one a 9 out of 10 because of the fact that it points out that, one, you shouldn't dismiss your superiors like that, and second, that everyone has to work together as a team regardless of rank, from the lowest private to the highest commander. Now, are there times where people make mistakes? Absolutely. It doesn't matter about rank. Rank does not matter when it comes to having to own up to your mistakes. That shows not just maturity, but also a show of character and development. Subjectively, I'd roughly keep the grading the same, a 9 out of 10. But that's just not only my general thoughts on this and the summary, but also when I was sharing my convention adventures and discussing things with Mr. Tui, who I am very grateful for having met. Okay, now we've come down to the wire. We're down to the top 5. This one is definitely more in terms of writing and why I like, these particular episodes. if my indication of what I enjoyed about Abandoned is a clue, then the two-parter Wired, which introduces another original character by the name of Sophie, which is actually an acronym. I do like the way the play of words here on this one, and the writing was good. Where we also get the introduction to the Delta Command Megazord. So, in summary of this one, the B Squad comes across a D Squad cadet by the name of Sophie. They don't realize that her name is actually an acronym till later. And where they're trying to defeat some Crybots in a training exercise. B Squad doesn't seem to handle it, and the only one that stands out is that girl. So eventually, Mora comes across Grum, and she asks, Grum for another chance to try and, defeat the Rangers. And she recruits someone by the name of Valko. And they realize that there's a particular bit of technology that is needed in order to try and control a particular robot. But this robot happens to be known by SPD. That is known by the name of Gorodon. So Valko mentions that in order for him to control this robot, he needs a particular piece of technology, and he points out the long name of it. A Series 1 processor hyper-intelligent encryptor. Oh, okay, hold on, I misspoke there. It's not encryptor, it's encryptor. The ones who are sometimes writing these articles, or even on Wikipedia, they even get stuff wrong. I'm just saying. But yeah, that is basically what Sophie stands for, the character. Series 1 processor hyper intelligent encryptor. So when the Rangers do face Valko, Valko obviously inquires with the Rangers, so where is it? Where is the Series 1 processor hyper intelligent encryptor? And they have no idea what he's talking about. So when Sophie comes in and does fight against Valko, he realizes this is the bit of technology that I'm looking for. So when Kat is trying to help with completing the Delta Base defense system, they get through the first phase, no problem. Second phase, however, is the trouble. So when they do try to go against the robot Gordon, the Delta Base does transform and it goes into crawler mode. So the base does eventually move. And eventually, when Valko does face the Rangers again, Bridge is the only one who seems to see the potential that Sophie has, but the others unfortunately do not. Because they eventually find out that Sophie is actually not human, but a cyborg. Or in this case, the term used here is actually incorrectly, because cyborg is not exactly the same as an android. But the point is, when they do find out about Sophie's identity, she does get expelled. The only one that disagrees with the expulsion is Bridge. As a result, however, Sophie does get captured by Valko. And then the Rangers find out what Valko was talking about earlier, and they practically lost her. So the only way that that the Rangers find out about this, including Doggie, by the way, Valko does use her to power up the robot of Gordon. And Sophie eventually does manage to escape. But Valko does catch up to her, and Doggie realizes that he knows what Sophie is capable of, and she emits a particular signal in her scream that is noticeable to Doggie. And when he says that, Doggie knows how Sophie works and all of that, that his ears are sensitive, Kat overhears what Doggie's saying, and she's like, "What are you talking about, sir?" And she notices that he's about to leave. And he's like, "Where are you going?" And he simply replies, "To a fight." I remember at least some of the dialogue on this, and what I really like is when Doggie does eventually confront Valko. Valko points out to Doggie, "Why are you going out of your way to defend her? She's just a cyborg." And Doggie just flat out replies, "And you're just a criminal." And he practically does school Valko easily. So by the time he does put Valko in a containment guard and brings Sophie back, Gordon does show up and is really trashing the SPD base. So they go through the process again of activating the Delta Base defense system. And phase 1 goes well. They struggle with phase 2. Sophie then does manage to convince them that she can do it. But having to go past the firewall is another thing, though, because if something does go wrong, Sophie could end up killing herself. But she eventually manages to engage phase 2. And then the Delta base does become, a Megazord eventually. So the Rangers eventually join in the fight, and then they destroy Gordon. And they realize that, they should have learned, they should know better than to judge something just based on looks alone. The whole don't judge a book by its cover. And that's an important lesson that they learn. Unfortunately, since Mora failed, Grum was so annoyed that eventually he undoes Mora, and we learn that is actually just her. That's not her normal form. We finally learn that Mora is actually Morgana, the adult form. That's her true form. And unfortunately, Grum is like laughing, and he's like, "They grew up so fast, don't they?" Which obviously, and that's where the episode ends. Objectively, I'd give this one, at best, a 9 out of 10. Subjectively, I'd roughly give this one the same in terms of, the same rating. The reason why I like the writing on this one so much is the fact that this is also another one of the times where they introduce technology into the mix, like advanced technology. One of the times they actually started doing this was with Lightspeed Rescue. FYI, for those of you guys who don't notice, Lightspeed Rescue also aired in the month of February, just like SPD. The difference, however, is a gap of 7 days. SPD aired on February 5th. Lightspeed Rescue, February 12th. And of course, Lightspeed Rescue does turn 25 this year because it started in the year 2000. Now, with that being said, that's just my general thoughts in terms of the episode Wired. So, overall, now that we got this part out of the way, this is where things start to really get interesting in terms of writing, because some of the ones that I'm choosing from these episodes basically has to do not just in terms of writing, but also the characterization of certain characters. Even though some of them are briefly introduced, you do get the idea in terms of what their purpose is and, you know, why they're around in the first place. Okay, coming in at number 4, we get the episode Dismissed. This one is where we get introduced to the rank of Supreme Commander. And that comes in the form of Supreme Commander Birdie. And the thing is that when the Supreme Commander is observing the Rangers and the way how they perform, he is not convinced that, you know, Commander Cruger is capable of actually, you know, leading the Rangers. So this is where things get a little bit interesting in terms of how rank sort of kind of like proves that some people kind of get in over their heads. So the difference being is that the approach that Supreme Commander Fowler Birdie does is different from how Cruger trains the Rangers. What's interesting is that Birdie assumes that by splitting them up that they'll be able to actually do well. What he doesn't realize is that when the viewpoint of Commander versus Supreme Commander is different, Birdie points out that he thinks by comparing Rangers battling to how Cruger fought on Sirius, not only does it show that Birdie doesn't know how times change, but also sometimes the tactics change with it. That what happened back in the day will not always translate well with, you know, newer recruits or people, because people and arguably aliens, all of them, you know, approach things differently depending on who you ask. And that is roughly what Cruger is pointing out. Eventually, when Cruger is actually dismissed, you could say fired in this case, Grum does take advantage of the situation, and he does fight Birdie and easily overpowers him. So when the Rangers eventually have to take matters into their own hands, eventually Cruger does the same and fights Grum himself. Now what's interesting is that Cruger does remember fighting Grum once before, and eventually we learn that Grum lost one horn when he fought against Cruger back then. And when Birdie realizes his mistake of actually, you know, splitting them up and doing things his way, that his approach was wrong. And eventually, Birdie reinstates Cruger, and he's telling Commander Cruger that, win this for all of us, and I'm willing to stay out of the way at this point. And there's a part at the end that really puts a grin on my face. And it's when Cruger looks at them and he's like, "Wipe those silly smirks off your faces. If you think it's going to be a holiday around here, then you're wrong. You're soft, spoiled, every last one of you. Shouldn't there be some training you should be attending to at this particular moment?" Mr. John Tui, I'm hoping you don't mind me doing an impression there of Doggie Cruger, but I think I can actually do the impression of Silverback a little bit better. I'm just having a little bit of fun here. Hope you don't mind, sir. But anyway, the Rangers are kind of looking at each other and they're like, "Oh," and they kind of like go back to base. And, Cruger is like, "It is so good to be back." And Cat simply replies, point blank, "Good to have you back, sir." Now, what they don't realize, however, is that in the episode Samurai, there is somebody that's actually following them. Now, I will, as much as I want to cover the episode where Sam does come in as the Omega Ranger, I do want to point out that because of budget constraints, at least how the story goes, is that they make the argument, Disney makes the argument that they likely didn't have the budget of being able to have the character in human form. So they went cheap and went with, Sam as a ball of energy. Writing wise, I would say that part is not as good, but are there times where Disney has actually, quote unquote, used the money well? Yes and no, depending on who you ask. Would I say that it could have been managed better? Yes, it could have. Do I think that it was mismanaged? Arguably, yes, and some fans would say the same. Now, with that part being said, I would objectively give this one at best a 7. Subjectively, I'd bump it up a point, at least an 8. But that's just roughly my general thoughts as well as the summary of the episode Dismissed. That episode aired on June 18 of 2005. Okay, now we're down to my top 3. In this case, I'm letting you guys know that the remaining 3 episodes are 2-parters, so I'm going to have to try and treat this as one lengthy episode. With that being said, at number 3, we're going straight to the beginning, hence the title, Beginnings. Both of these episodes have aired at the same time, which was February 5th. Like I said, that's the time when SPD aired. The third episode, Confronted, I'm just reading a little bit off of Wikipedia, that aired on the date that Lightspeed Rescued aired. I'm just saying for context. With that being said, we do get the introduction and the start of who the Rangers are, what their abilities are, and the like. So Skybridge and Sid are part of B Squad, and they're assigned to bring in a couple of criminals, and they find out that these so-called criminals, as they're facing them, they have abilities just like them. And so they eventually learn that Z and Jack, despite being locked up in jail, they're given the choice. You can either spend your time in jail or try and join and become something more. Z eventually takes that choice, and when they morph, Sky thinks he's going to be the Red Ranger, but he's not. He becomes the Blue Ranger. And prior to the start of the whole thing, when the Tribune Empire does invade, Sky is given that character test by Commander Cruger. And as I pointed out earlier when I was doing my list of 10 episodes, in the episode endings, Sky gives a different answer. But at the start, when Commander Cruger asks, if I was to appoint Sid as Red Ranger, would you be willing to follow her into battle? Sky assumes that a girl can't lead. This does bring up an interesting point to an extent, but it does show Sky being a bit, I'm going to say it point blank, Sky is being a bit misogynistic here. And he assumes that just because a girl, can be a Red Ranger, he thinks that they can't lead. I actually will disagree with him on this. There are some that can, but to his credit, he isn't entirely wrong. He is wrong in stating that he thinks that Z can lead. I mean, not Z, Sid. But character-wise, the biggest flaw that has constantly been proven again and again and again. I don't care about ethnicity. I don't care about, any of that stuff. It may appear misogynistic, but the truth of the fact is this. The one flaw that will always hold most, let me say it again, the one character flaw that will hold most women back is emotions. I don't care about feelings. I don't care whose feelings I hurt. That is the truth that will never be refuted. Now, are there some who can not just hone their emotions, but also utilize it in a leadership-like manner? Yes, there are some who are able to balance the two. Balance their emotions as well as their logic, as well as knowing the challenges that comes with being a leader. However, there are things that do come up in terms of writing issues. The problem with A Squad, number one, when they learn that, they're supposedly losing, you never hear about them again till way later in the series. The reason for their defection is one thing, but how it led to that point, poorly executed. Let me say it again. The circumstances with A Squad, poorly executed in terms of writing. You never hear about them for a long time. Why? They don't go over that. However, I will say this. While I am pointing out the flaws of both genders, men and women, there are some women who are capable of leading. Not always. Because I know people are going to take the words, twist it, leave out other details that I already just pointed out. Again, the flaws of women, it is always there. Now, can you have a character that has to constantly fight against said flaws in order to develop their character? Yes, it can happen. Are most capable of writing it? Depends on who you ask. Now, with that part out of the way, when Grum eventually does invade Earth and then sends out his, Trubian soldiers to try and, attack, Jack eventually does join the team, and, it does take time for him to prove his worth, but eventually all 5 Rangers do manage to temporarily push Grum back, at least his army, so to speak. And Grum eventually learns that, Earth is not as weak as it seems, and the Rangers do prove to be worthy adversaries, and that it will take time for him to try and quote-unquote conquer Earth. Overall, I will say that objectively, I would say that this is around a 7 out of 10. Subjectively, I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. Now, while I am pointing out that some fans are total hypocrites in terms of going with the whole progress is actually a good thing, I'm going to have to debunk this. Because when you have ego and you're eternally ruled by that, I don't care about rank, I don't care if you're male or female, but when women fail to realize that men are different from women and that you let your ego get the best of you and you think you can bully guys around, then you prove that you are not worthy of it. I don't care about feelings. There are some who know how to do the job, but then you also have ones who are eternally incapable of doing it. Not just because of ego, not just because of emotions, but the fundamental fact that when you have both and you prove that you don't have quality education that can back up your claims, I don't give a damn. I do not. You are unfit for the job just on that alone. Combined with ego and your emotions, the fact that you failed in your pathetic life to try and hone that for all those years wasted. And for what? And for what? Honestly, it's times like this that just prove that not only have men been at fault for, messing things up, but there are women who are just as guilty. And there are also female criminals. Let's not kid ourselves. But yeah, I had to put a little bit of real life perspective on this, even though this is just the start of SPD. So, from this point out, now we're getting into like the nitty gritty of why I like these last 2 picks, even though they're 2-parters on SPD, and why the writing is so good. Okay guys, now before I get started, I want to give not just a quick shout out to Catherine Nakia and John Tui on this, but also to give respect to the late Ronald Lee Ermey. Now, not only was this guy also in the U.S. Marines, but he was also in the classic 1987 film Full Metal Jacket. John Tui does mention about this, and I mean, I'm just reading some of this stuff off of Wikipedia. Um, the late Ronald Lee Ermey, may God rest his soul, the guy was up to the rank of gunnery sergeant. And when I was asking the question on Power Rangers Playback when I was originally a member, if you guys notice on the recording when I was doing this, that I showed the screenshot of my question, and John does mention the film. The timestamp roughly is around 41 minutes and 38 seconds, roughly where I do ask my question. So with that part being said, I will be playing that part. Now, if you guys want to hear some of the other questions, I will put a link in the description down below. But with that being said, Mr. Ronald Lee Ermey, sir, thank you for your service, and may you rest in peace, sir.
Super Chat is Pierre Sales, one of our channel members.
Yes.
Super Chat, raise them up high. When playing SWAT instructor, Silverback and Cruger in the two-part SWAT
Oh, yeah.
of SPD, how did you alternate between the two roles?
Okay, so like I said, Full Metal Jacket was one of my favorite all-time movies. You know, it was heavy. But I loved Lee Ermey's performance as drill instructor in Full Metal Jacket. And so when I applied that in that heavy Southern accent, very direct, into Silverback, and I had such a short amount of time, and when they were trying to cast it, I was like, man, I could smash this role. You know, like I know when my cup is half empty, and I know when my cup is half full as an actor. So when I see something that I mean, like, I could show off, give it to me, I could slay this role, you know. But when I got that and saw the script, I was just, it was Lee Ermey for me. And then I had to find the physicality of a Silverback without making him look like, oh, he's a gorilla. So you know what I mean. So I gave him this weight. I saw Planet of the Apes, which I thought was but you know, I'm a Tim Burton fan, but the physicality in there was the same. And then to have the upright, yeah. So that's how I did Silverback. And then I applied it, and I was drilling them, man. I was drilling in the SPD cast to the point where they hated me. Some of them hated me, you know.
Who hated you?
Well, you just like the characters really hated Silverback. You know what I'm saying? Like that's for me. I had to make them hate me. So, as soon as I come out of the truck and I'm like, I am Srgt. Silverback. I am the worst nightmare you have ever seen. Do you understand that? And it was like a Louisiana thick accent. I didn't want to make them from the Bayou though, so I was just like, yeah, it was cool. But in terms of them hating me, so we had these moments where they'll be abseiling and climbing up on the trees, and then they'll come down and they're running and doing push-ups, and I go off script and I'm just drilling them. Yeah. Really harsh. I'm not swearing, there's no profanity, but I'm like, yeah. You look like a McMuffin. Like I was just Do you want me to get your mama? Is that what you need? You need your mama? You can't even give me 10 push-ups. Count them out. 1, 2, faster. Yeah,
That's
fun. So yeah, Chris and Brandon will come up and be like, dude, man, you need to chill. I'm like, no, this is going method.
No, you need to give me 20.
We're going method. We're not friends now. I want it to be real. Dude, man, tell this dude to chill.
I love it.
This is just some of the tricks in the bag. Because like, I don't think you should play with other actors on set. You know, like for me, if you're going to do any acting technique, if you're going to go all artsy fartsy, then you need to let the other person know what your process is and your technique. Otherwise, you're going to offend them, and they're going to think you're a douche. And there's a lot of that in Hollywood already. So I just like working with professional people because you want it to shine, man. It's not about you. I don't care how big of a star you are. But when you're ping-ponging a scene, you have to be equal. You can't, like, if your pay grade is hundreds of millions and over here you're here for 100,000, the art will equalize you. I think you should always ping-pong equal, make that scene work, you know? And then some people only turn it on when the camera's on them and they're not there for the other actor.
Yeah.
You've got the AD sitting there reading lines. I've been around some actors just so selfish sometimes, and they're not in it for maybe what I am. So I try not to expect me from other actors or other people, but I do try to have a professional courtesy attitude on set, so it's reciprocated. And I've just told that person, listen, tell this diva to go over there, put a bit of tape on the wall, tell the AD to read the lines on cue, and I will give you a performance. And that's where you have to have that confidence in yourself as an actor to deliver, because they pay you for it. That's what people don't get. You want to come and shine and all that, but you got to put in the work. You got to come in there, repeat these scenes, and so like we don't just all show up on these Hollywood sets and it's easy. Like, there's a lot of waiting around. You got to be focused. You're at catering. You're avoiding crafts table because you're watching your weight. Like, there's everything jamming back and forth, and then you have 5 seconds to go out there and deliver this line. We're sorry to have you waiting for 8 hours. Now go, and cut. Did you do that again? Reset, go. People don't get the craft. They don't get the art. They see all the shining in it. You got to know that there's a process to that. And I think, the more we have people understanding the technical aspects, that's why I think there's more jobs out there for being behind the camera than in front of it. But if you want to be in front of it, you got to come with a different attitude. You got to come, I mean, I had this chat with Nakia before about, I've been in audition rooms with a lot of good looking people, and I already sit there going, I know my point of difference. I know what my point of difference is, what I have to offer. I might not have that chiseled body. I might not have, that hair, but I know, and it's liberating. It's liberating.
Yes. Why didn't I know you when I was acting? I could never get past that with auditions, of that insecurity and that comparison, and you just have to have that.
Oh man, like they tell you, a lot of them tell me, I've been in the rooms where you're too big, too old, you're too fat. Like, I get it, man. I get it. And I'm sitting there like, and no one talks about that. No one talks about the leading processes. When I was younger, I used to have this thing with other actors. It's like, don't talk to me about an audition. I don't want to hear it. Don't talk about the what ifs and the hopes. I don't want to hear that. Like, don't talk about auditions. I say it to other actors, don't talk about auditions. You might mention to your loved ones a callback, but it's only when you have the role that you can sing on the mountain. So know your levels, man. There's levels to this.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you like auditioning?
I love it if it's a chunky role. Like, I'm at a point now where I'm very lucky to have choices, but even with your choices, like they say, your talents are your choices. You got to be careful what you attach to, because like sometimes you haven't been working for like 3-4 months. You get this audition, and it's it's a smaller production, this and that, and you're like, okay, is my career going to go lateral or going to go forward with this? So you have to make it. And then sometimes you're like, man, I haven't worked anyway. I want to work. I want to create something, and you're like, the combination might be wrong. It's like a first-time director who doesn't know what the hell they're doing. You don't know what the DOP is fresh. They've just done commercials. Like, you could be part of a really bad B-grade movie, but the money was good. So what's the give and take here? So I keep saying to people, there's so many levels to this with your choices. So I'm grateful that I've got a team around me where we communicate well, man. So give me everything, because a lot of things that I've booked have gone against the grain in terms of how I look. And that's where I knew that the management team I've got right now are putting me up for everything. I get it. It's a Caucasian role. He's in his mid-30s, and I'm like thinking, if I put enough makeup on, can I look 30? And then I'm like, nah, bugger that. Give me some bigger roles. Oh, he's a villain. So some of the choices I've made, I'm just like, and this is going to sound selfish, but I don't answer to everybody out there. I answer to a certain few people that I'm keeping alive. And I go to myself, how can I show off my skill and my talent in this? What is this role going to be enough for me to go in there so I can make people go, oh, boom, he done it again. He's doing it again. Like every movie that I've been part of, I've tried to be as versatile as I can with how I look and what I do. My training, I went through training just so I didn't look like I walked off a football or a rugby field and into an audition and was lucky enough to get a role, So when I say that there's levels to this business, because some people look at it as a business, some people look at it for the art, some people look at it, and I'm just like, I look at it from a standpoint where I love doing this. It has to coexist with me making money from it. because I don't see myself doing anything else. I feel this is what I'm born to do. So, I surround myself with the right people that motivate. Don't be around people that take a lot. Be around people that share a lot and share positive stuff. You know what I mean? Not just offload their stuff on you for you to be the counselor. I'm like, my man, I got enough stuff on my plate, right? Let's build each other up. And with the fan base, with the Rangers, they're like, too many people like tearing each other down so they can feel up, And that's why when I talk to people here from being grown up in a tough neighborhood, it's just like, we can take it. So their attitude transpires onto everything that I apply myself to. I'm around a lot of smart people. I'm not tech savvy, and they like to feel really powerful by being in. I'm like, yeah, but you haven't been punched in the face before. Do you know what that's like?
Do you know? Well, let me punch you.
And for me, it's just this. I can't go through the pep talking. I just like this, but all respectful, being respectful with her, but just like, life is short. I don't have time for the fake, man. It's too short, and our youth are just looking for the leadership and so many material, stupid things sometimes. And I'm like, love yourself first. Just find your grounding, find your zen, man, and then just push it out there.
Yes.
So now that you guys kind of get the context in terms of what was going on here, I'm going to be jumping a little bit ahead. But when John, Tui, and I were discussing a little bit about that two-parter SWAT, as well as my question about it, I do also have a signed poster by him where it shows he did not only voice Doggie Cruger, but also Srgt. Silverback. And I wasn't trying to be rude or anything when we were discussing about it, but to an extent, it was more, the look of it was more orangutan than it was gorilla, but the way how he describes, the walk and all of that, and the way how he studied the movements when trying to get into this character, I do agree with him on that. But I love the way how he approaches doing Silverback, who is totally leagues different from Doggie Cruger in terms of how he approaches things. So again, I'm jumping a little bit ahead. I apologize in advance, but it's particularly the second part of SWAT that really gets at me. And I love the way how, if you listen very carefully, you can sort of tell it's John Tui to an extent. But it's when when Silverback does reveal himself, and Jack is a bit surprised. He's like, "What?" And Silverback point blank asks the Rangers, "What the hell just happened?" And Jack is like, "We were preparing to fight that monster, sir." Preparing? You prepare to go on a date. You prepare dinner. You prepare to go on vacation. You are already prepared. You do not wait for your enemy to come to you. You go to your enemy. Do you understand me? And the Rangers, their confidence and ego kind of get dejected so badly that they're like, "Yes, sir." Well, what was that? "You are the sorriest group of Rangers that Cruger's ever sent me. You are disgraced for those who came before you. You are disgraced for those who fought for you. You are disgraced to SPD. You lost your color." And so he practically demorphs them using the remote, and he orders them to hand over their morphers. To which Sky tries to, argue. He's like, "Now wait just a... Do not question my orders, blue boy." And just the way how it comes out, I was like, as I said earlier, you do not want to cross Silverback. Like, when he means it, he flippin' means it. Now, with my little impression out of the way how this plays out, and I will admit, I did also watch the Sentai version of this as well. The events are pretty much similar in the fact that we see the cadets bickering amongst themselves, acting like just kids at this point. Like, they're not being mature. And Doggie is like really annoyed at this point. And basically what happens is Cruger and Cat learn that there's an upcoming threat that's heading their way. In addition, Cat is also trying to finish up the SPD SWAT technology. However, in Cat's haste in trying to finish it up, there's a particular bit of technology that gets destroyed. And the interesting thing part here, I mean, I'm kind of like remembering this bit by bit. Cat is going, tell me I didn't fry the quantum enhancer like a few times. And then Boom comes in, he's like, what just happened? To which Doggie replied, Cat just fried the quantum enhancer. And so, in order to get that fixed, she needs that particular piece of tech. But Thresher and Stench, who are the ones that actually steal the technology, they eventually download the schematics that are given by Piggy. And what they don't realize, both the Rangers and the enemy, is that Piggy is a double agent of sorts. But in addition to that, the fact that the Rangers are constantly bickering amongst themselves while facing against Thresher and Stench, this does not sit well with Doggie Cruger at all, to which he sends them off to face Srgt. Silverback. And Silverback is totally different from Doggie, like I said earlier, in terms of mannerisms. And he puts the Rangers through their paces, and it doesn't go well. So they're fighting against Crybots. They keep fighting amongst themselves, and eventually they get demoted to D Squad, which is the lowest rank in SPD. Eventually, they do have to overcome their differences. And, you know, when Silverback realizes that they still haven't, you know, worked out their differences, he says he's going to, you know, send out a letter to have them, you know, be dismissed from the academy. And Bridge is like asking them, you know, sir, you got to give us another chance. And he's like, another chance? You've had too many chances. And Bridge just simply goes, please? So Silverback is looking at all of them, and then he looks back at his bulldog robot, who looks back at the sergeant, and he's like, and he simply tells them, you know, I will think about it. In the meantime, you can take, you know, he gives them another route to try and take of the course. It's a lot shorter, but they still don't work out their differences. Back on Earth, Doggie and Omega Ranger are trying to face Thresher and Stench, but with the technology that was stolen, they get bested, unfortunately get captured. Back on, you know, the SWAT training grounds, the Rangers do realize that they have to work together to work out their differences. So what happens is each of them is supposedly hearing one of them calling for help. And eventually they find out that, you know, at least Jack finds out that this is one of Silverback's tricks. And eventually they amend their friendship, as well as, you know, working together as a team. This, of course, does impress Silverback, and the Rangers apologize to him for how they behaved. And the fact that they finally amended their differences also shows that they have passed SWAT training. And they're allowed to keep the truck, and they use it to defend Earth. So when Silverback calls back to Earth headquarters that they're ready to come home, Cat points out that Doggie has been taken and that the Rangers are needed. Eventually, the Rangers do activate their SWAT tech and manage to take out Stench and Thresher. And eventually, they realize that, Doggie was right to send them out to try and, cool their heads a bit. But Sky realizes that despite all that's happened, that, the fight for Earth has only just begun. This particular two-parter was one that I enjoyed because of not just the writing, but also the fact that John Tui was willing to undergo even more than what was needed. So objectively, I'd give this one at best a 9 out of 10. Subjectively, this is one where I would actually give it a 10 out of 10. But there's one where I actually would give a 10 out of 10 even more. And that's my number one pick in terms of both writing as well as subjectively. Now we get to my number one pick, which is Reflections. What's interesting about this two-parter is that this is the one and only time where Sky is not only the Red Ranger, but he also gets to use the Battleizer. In addition, before I go on any further about this episode, this is the only time where in Sentai we actually get to see the use of a Battleizer, effectively speaking. But the difference being in terms of function, where the weapon is used differently. In the American version, we see the weapon used as a sword. In Sentai, most of it I would say is the same, save for one thing. Rick is actually used in terms of a firearm. In this case, I would say it's more of a rifle. So when Decaret is holding it, you can sort of see that it's almost kind of like a firearm, and he's kind of holding it this way. Because the length of it, you could say, is almost like the barrel of a rifle. That's how he's using it in the Sentai version. Now, what's interesting about this is that we learn a little bit about Sky's father, who was a Red Ranger, and the reason why he wanted to become one in the first place, because his dad was his hero. He looked up to him. Unfortunately, we learn that there is a particular criminal by the name of Murloc, and Cat points out to Doggie, "Sir, I looked into his file, and, Cat understands who Murloc is, why he was locked up in a specific type of prison, and Sky's given the debriefing in terms of, the fact that the Rangers think that there's a bunch of criminals that have actually that escape containment, and they've all been fought by them before. But that actually isn't the case. And there's only one criminal who seems to know who that type of person is. So Sky offers to go and interrogate this criminal. And the one rule is that there should be no reflective surfaces for Murloc to escape from, because that's how he can get out. So Sky is then sent to Gamma Orion, which is where the person is, and he visits Murloc to try and and get some information out of him. Unfortunately, Sky does get the information that he does need, but in turn, Murloc asks for one memory from Sky. So, turns out the culprit that they're trying to find goes by the name of S.W.A.T, which does fit the name because he keeps using these different aliases. The Rangers do manage to apprehend S.W.A.T, but as a result, when Sky mentions about his father, and that's actually the saddest memory because, you know, he actually does comply with Murloc's request. Unfortunately, Sky does shed a tear, thus enabling Murloc to escape. And Sky is just baffled by what happened, and he realizes that, you know, he was tricked. Unfortunately, when Sky is actually berating himself for this, Jack does kind of like, you know, roast Sky for this. He says that you told me once that, you know, you looked up to your father and that you wanted to become Red Ranger. And now you want to quit because you messed up once? I guess you're not like your father after all. I will say that Jack does have a point on this. But Doggie also made a mistake by withholding information from Sky. And what's interesting thing here is that despite the other Rangers getting captured, as well as Omega and the Zords, by Murloc, Doggie does realize that he also made a mistake. And in addition to that, Murloc manipulating Sky's emotions, but like that, in order to escape, that is definitely low. So when Omega does manage to confront Murloc, he realizes that Murloc does have a weakness, and he manages to exploit Murloc by having him try to open up, and he shatters the mirrors. This eventually frees the Zords as well as the Rangers themselves. And Murloc, you know, continues to taunt Sky, stating that, you know, he's weak just like his father. But the Rangers aren't having it and telling Sky that, you know, they've got his back and that Sky's father was a great Ranger. And Murloc still taunts Sky, stating that, you know, it doesn't quite matter, you know, what color he is. He doesn't have what it takes to defeat him. So Jack then gives his morpher to Sky and tells him, it's only right that you bring him in. And he's like, you're sure? Absolutely. So Sky eventually does get the chance to become the Red Ranger, uses the battleizer to bring down Murloc, and right after that, Jack does ask him, so what was it like being the Red Ranger? He says, it was great being the Red Ranger, but I'm fine with being the Blue Ranger. And he points out that heroes do come in all colors, which is true, because there were other Rangers who were different colors. So Sky does make that point. And the fact that he was able to honor his father, his sacrifice and what he did, and then Jack, you know, letting Sky use his morpher to fight Murloc and also use the battleizer to bring him in, that shows a great deal of respect from Jack. And also, there is a point where Sky may not have always agreed with Jack with some of his decisions, but he still respects him regardless. Even though he is Red Ranger, he still respects him as also a fellow friend and teammate. So despite their differences, you know, they still respect each other, even though there's a bit of rivalry between the two. So if I really had to give my rating on this overall, I would say 10 out of 10 in terms objectively. Same case in terms of subjectively, this is probably my most favorite two-parter episode of SPD. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this top 10 list. Let me know in the comments down below what are your favorites. This has been Skyhound, also known as Xavier Pierce, Geek Archivist. Stay safe, stay sane, and as always, stay humble. May the power protect you.